I never expected that call. 4 years, 4 long years had passed since I'd heard Jake's voice. And then, out of the blue, on a regular Tuesday, he was there. My phone had flashed with an unknown number, and I'd almost ignored it, but something in me, maybe curiosity, maybe a twisted sense of closure, made me pick it up. Sophie, his voice was a low murmur, rich and familiar, the way it had once been at 2 a.m. in the night when he'd whispered promises into my ear. "It's Jake. I'm in town. Can we talk?" I felt every piece of me freeze and melt simultaneously. It was surreal. This was the man who'd shattered me, the one I had rebuilt myself around after he walked away, leaving me stranded with dreams that had dissolved like sugar in rain. But even now, there was that pull. Something raw and dangerous inside of me wanted to say yes. Maybe I needed to hear an apology, or maybe I just wanted to see if he'd changed. Maybe I wanted him to see how much I had changed, too. When I walked into the bar that night, my heels clicking against the polished floor, my mind was a whirlpool of emotions. I scanned the room, my heart racing, until I saw him. He hadn't changed much. A little more rugged around the edges, maybe. His shoulders looked broader, his face a bit more lined, and his eyes, those dark, intense eyes that once made me feel like I was the only woman in the world. He rose to greet me, a small, tentative smile tugging at his lips. "Sophie," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and something else. Regret, maybe? Or was it hope? I don't know what that was exactly. "Jake," I replied as neutrally as I could manage, trying to keep my own emotions at bay. We exchanged pleasantries at first, falling into that safe, polite distance that people who share a complicated history often do. He talked about his job, his travels, the places he'd been. I found myself nodding, keeping my face neutral even as my mind screamed with questions. Why now? Why reach out after all this time? After a few minutes, he looked at me, his gaze piercing, searching. "You look amazing, Soph," he murmured, his voice softer. "Better than I remember." I felt a slight flush of satisfaction. Despite everything, I still wanted him to see that I was doing fine, that I had rebuilt myself piece by piece, even if I wasn't completely sure I believed it myself. But then he leaned forward, his eyes dropping to the table, as if he couldn't quite bring himself to meet my gaze. "I have to tell you something," he said, almost to himself. And that's when he told me. He told me that leaving me was his biggest regret, that he'd never stopped thinking about me, that he'd replayed our final moments together over and over in his head. And then finally, he looked up, his expression raw and unguarded. "I never stopped loving you, Sophie, and I've hated myself every day since for not fighting harder to keep you." My chest tightened. The words I'd wanted to hear for so long, the ones I had dreamt about, were suddenly laid bare in front of me. And instead of relief, all I felt was an overwhelming sadness. Because 4 years was a long time. Long enough for hurt to bury itself deep under scar tissue. Long enough for old dreams to fade into dusty memories. But he wasn't done. "And you know," he continued, a faint tremor in his voice, "I always wanted a family with you. I dreamed about it more than you know, especially a son." And that's when something inside me snapped. The words spilled out before I could stop them. "I was pregnant, you know, when you left me." The look on his face was like a punch to the gut. His eyes went wide, his face turning ashen. He sat back, visibly shaken, as if I had just physically struck him. I watched his reaction, feeling a strange, twisted sense of satisfaction mixed with regret. The truth was, I hadn't been pregnant, not even close. But something in his casual mention of wanting a family, wanting a son, stirred up all the old anger and betrayal I had buried deep. I let the lie hang in the air, watched him grapple with it, watched him squirm under the weight of what he thought he'd lost. He cleared his throat, his voice barely more than a whisper. "What? What happened?" I kept my face as neutral as I could, leaning back as if the memory still haunted me. "I didn't want to tell you then. I thought maybe you'd stay, but not for the right reasons. I didn't want that, but later, I lost him." I dropped my gaze, pretending to compose myself. It was a boy. Jake looked like he'd been struck. His hand came up to cover his mouth, and he looked away, pain etched into every line of his face. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But the years of hurt I had endured for his inability to commit kept me steady, kept me silent. The rest of the evening was a blur. I could see him struggling to find the right words, to somehow make sense of the bombshell I just dropped on him. But in the end, there was nothing to say. When we finally parted ways, he was still pale, visibly shaken, and I watched him walk away without a single glance back. It was only later, as I lay in bed that night, that the weight of what I had done began to settle in. I hadn't planned to lie to him. I hadn't even thought about it. But in that moment, something dark and bitter had taken over, and the words had slipped out as easily as if they were the truth. The days that followed were strange. Part of me felt satisfied, vindicated, knowing he was hurting, even if just a fraction of what he'd put me through. But another part of me felt hollow, as if I had betrayed some part of myself by stooping to that level. As time passed, I thought about calling him, telling him the truth. But every time I picked up the phone, I couldn't bring myself to do it. The lie had already taken root, twisting into something ugly and irrevocable. I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying our conversation on an endless loop. 1,000 emotions tugged at me, each one cutting deeper than the last. Regret, satisfaction, anger, and longing. I felt all emotions rush through me all at once. God, I hated that longing so much. It felt like betrayal, wanting the man who'd broken my heart to feel just a little of all what I'd felt back then. Yet somehow, it still lingered. In the silence of my room, memories of us started flooding back. Memories I thought I'd buried. There was that night, years ago, the night he'd whispered, "I love you," for the first time. I remember every single detail. The way he'd brushed my hair from my face, his fingers so gentle, like he was afraid I'd shatter if he held me too tightly. I'd felt his warmth against me, his heartbeat thrumming as his hand slid around my waist, pulling me close. Our first night together was electric. It's a memory I could never fully shake off from myself. There was something so intense, almost overwhelming, in the way he looked at me, as if I were the only woman in the world. His lips traced lines across my neck, down to my shoulder, each touch igniting a fire I couldn't control. We'd fallen together like two puzzle pieces that just fit, and in those moments, I'd believed every promise he'd made, believed that this was it. It was the love that everyone searches for, the one that fills every empty part of you. But those nights, those were the times that kept me hooked long after he was gone. I could still feel the ghost of his touch on my skin, the way his fingertips traced delicate patterns along my spine, making me shiver. He always knew exactly how to pull me apart and put me back together, and no matter how much I wanted to forget, I couldn't. And that's what made this even harder. When I ran my fingers over my collarbone that night, it wasn't my hand I felt, but his. I closed my eyes, letting the memory wash over me, and it was almost like he was there, his breath warm against my skin, his hands pulling me close, anchoring me in a way I'd never experienced before him. The next morning, the ache lingered. It felt like an unshakable reminder of all the nights we'd shared, nights that had felt like pure magic at the time, but now haunted me with a bittersweet clarity. Days went by, and I tried to drown myself in routine, work, and endless distractions. But that conversation with him lingered, the sharp edges of it digging in at the quietest moments. I told myself I was over it, over him, and yet here I was, haunted by memories I couldn't shake. The frustration only added to the mix of emotions swirling inside me. He had been my everything once, and that wasn't easy to just forget. One evening, while going through an old box of things I'd brought with me when I left, I stumbled upon a photo of us from years ago. We were both smiling, his arms wrapped around me, and the look in his eyes. Back then, I was so sure that look meant he was as all in as I was. I brushed my thumb over the photo, and a familiar warmth spread through me, reminding me of a time when things were simpler. I couldn't help but remember one of our weekends away, at a cabin by the lake. We'd stayed up all night talking, laughing, and sharing secrets as if time had no hold on us. He had this way of making me feel like I was the center of his world, even if now, looking back, I knew it hadn't been entirely true. But that night was unforgettable. I remembered the warmth of the fire crackling in the fireplace, the glow of the moon through the window casting soft light on us. He'd pulled me close, his fingers tracing gentle lines down my arm, whispering things that made me feel like we were the only two people on Earth. I close my eyes now, replaying it in my mind, and for a moment, I let myself get lost in it. As the months passed, I found myself thinking less about him and more about myself. There was no dramatic epiphany, no moment where I was suddenly healed. It was quieter. I was accepting the present. I understood that what we had was something beautiful, intense, and flawed. And while I'd mourned the way things had ended, I began to see that maybe, in some way, it had to end. That realization didn't erase the hurt, but it softened the edges. I never told him the truth. Part of me regrets that, wonders what might have happened if I'd been honest. But a larger part of me understands that it was something I needed to carry alone. He was gone now, and with him, so was the part of me that had held on to the what ifs. One afternoon, I took that old photo of us and placed it back in the box. I closed the lid, not to forget, but to preserve. Some things are meant to be left in the past, to be cherished for what they were, but not what they could have been. Looking back, I no longer felt the same ache. There was a peace in letting go, in forgiving myself, and in understanding that love isn't always about the ending. Sometimes it's about the journey, the memories, and the growth that come from it. And so, I let him go one last time, this time for good.